in Limpopo, and then apparently 7 days later, my mom decided I'm a teenager. I can do this postpartum traveling. She traveled all the way from Limpopo to Soweto, where I was then fully socialized into this person that I am today. So I am the chairperson of the Soweto Cannabis Association, and when I was much younger, around like 21, I had the craziest idea, and I decided to start my own research institution. No background in academia, nothing like that. We were just doing ECD programs. We ran a literacy club. We were doing indigenous knowledge systems, literacy, as well as digital literacy, entrepreneurship, blah, 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 etc., etc. And now I find myself here as someone I'd like to consider a knowledge producer. My work centers around indigenous knowledge systems, anthropology, and archaeology. So I will be presenting my research, cannabis as a natural resource and indigenous knowledge system, shaping regulatory frameworks in emerging industries. So yeah, let's see, how do we go next over here? There we go. So a lot of the times when we speak about cannabis, we're usually talking about commerce, commodification, extractivism, and what we can gain from this beautiful plant, and especially in these kinds of rooms, mostly the doctors are talking about what we can gain from it as a medicine, but the rest of us are trying to figure out how are we making the money in this thing, So it's often only discussed as only an emerging commercial industry. The medicinal side and all the other side, we're talking about it more from a regulatory perspective of how can we use this to make the industry better. So my question centers around how do we reconnect African people with the indigenous knowledge systems that have always existed within our communities? How then do we also center cannabis as an indigenous knowledge system, looking at it not from the fragmented medicinal, recreational hemp, but as an entire plant and how it can serve humanity? So I've already gone through what I do: cannabis education, public awareness and community learning, indigenous knowledge preservation through anthropology and archaeological work, economic development, community-based cannabis economies, youth development, because I am still a youth since someone tried to remind me yesterday I have 3 years left, We also try to do a little bit of policy advocacy, equitable cannabis regulation, research, ethnobotany, and African indigenous systems. So what my focus is right now is how do we define cannabis? How are we looking at cannabis? And then I came to the conclusion it is natural. So like gold, like oil, like platinum, cannabis is a natural resource. A natural resource is a material, biological or ecological asset that exists within nature and contributes to human survival, development, healing, and economic activity. So of course, cannabis ticks all of those boxes. So it fits because it can be understood as an agricultural resource, a medicinal, a cultural, a spiritual resource, a scientific, and an economic resource, as well as a resource of heritage, since people assign meaning to this plant through their own lenses. So I like to say something: cannabis is a human indigenous knowledge system. It fits within so many cultures. Each culture has their own meaning assigned to cannabis. All right, so cannabis in African history, because a lot of the academic people like to argue that because cannabis is not native to Africa, right, then it cannot be an indigenous knowledge system. However, indigeneity, it does not only come from nativity, it also comes from how people use it, what context they've had with it, and how they assign meaning. So, in the historical sense, traditional healing practices, sorry, so I've just noticed that my graphic guy did not put spaces between the words, but anyway, so spiritual and ritual practices, textile and fiber, social and communal use, trade and exchange systems. So here, many African communities have cultivated and used cannabis long before colonial criminalization frameworks were imposed. So we come then to my favorite uncomfortable topic, colonialism and criminalization. So I've noticed one thing that we do in a lot of rooms that I'm in, because I speak quite frankly about the dangers and the effects of colonialism and the taking over of my people. We get uncomfortable because we like to assign a personal meaning to things. So we take it personally a little bit when people are discussing things like these, but we need to be more objective. It's not a personal attack on anyone. Most of us were not here when colonialism happened, but the thing is, we need to discuss these things so that we understand how to move forward together. We need to discuss these uncomfortable things that we might not like to hear, because then we feel we take them on personally. We carry these issues that we've inherited from our predecessors. I want to say today, can we please not take these things personally anymore? When I say Europeans, I don't mean you people sitting here with me that I talk to and I share joints with. I'm talking about the colonial things, the systematic oppression, the things that we're still finding hard to discuss, that we're still finding hard to look at. And unfortunately, because of that, we won't be able to solve the racial tensions that exist because we don't want to be honest with each other. So that was my little tangent, nothing to do with the presentation. But I think we all know, we've discussed this in length over the past few days, what colonialism has done and how it has displaced indigenous growers, and how I want us to not repeat the extractive cycle, right? Indigenous communities don't need help. They need investment. They need collaboration. They need partnership. Let's change how we look at this thing and how we frame it. Let's move away from looking at people as victims and more as partners. Let's look at this as an equitable transaction. We have things to learn from each of us. I say this all the time. Teachers can learn from students. That's why I was such a little bit of a horrible student, because I would often say, no, but teacher, bibliography does not mean that. But I think at this point, my biggest issue is the over-policing of Black and Indigenous communities. If we can tackle that and speak about where that comes from, honestly, I think we'll have a lot of our issues sorted out. So let's go to Indigenous knowledge systems. What are they? So Indigenous knowledge systems are accumulated bodies of knowledge developed by communities over generations through interaction with their environment. So this means plants, this means water, this means everything, including what we've built today. So IKS includes agricultural knowledge, healing systems, environmental stewardship, spiritual frameworks, oral traditions, and community governance systems. This goes back to yesterday's conversation about sovereignty and tribal sovereignty, right? And that's where IKS comes in. So cannabis and IKS in Africa, it was historically transmitted through families, healers, growers, and communities. That's how it became an African indigenous knowledge system. Same as if I go to Jamaica, the people have assigned their own meaning to this thing. They have their own rituals, their own practices, and that's how it also then becomes a human indigenous knowledge system. All right, so why does IKS matter in cannabis regulation? Policy without indigenous inclusion creates inequality. The most important thing is to move away from the extractive models of the past and create new models that serve the entire community. We need to move away from looking at what can I gain from this community to more of a how can I benefit the community and what can the community benefit from me, from what I know, from what I've learned, from all the things that I've come across. So modern cannabis policy often prioritizes large corporations, big pharma, our hated, most hated people, right? Pharmaceutical interests, export markets, which are very inaccessible to the regular guy on the streets in Soweto, high capital investors, while legacy growers remain criminalized. Indigenous markets remain excluded, and indigenous expertise remains undervalued. So instead of looking at indigenous expertise and saying, I'm learning from something, you're saying, I'm helping these people, which is the wrong way to look at it because we're all here to learn. We can all benefit from each other. So no one's helping anyone. Instead, this is a mutually beneficial relationship. So communities that carry the risks of prohibition, the Sneemans, your Growa in the Eastern Cape, they should also benefit from legalization. They should not be left behind. They should not experience barriers to entry into the market because they are essentially the market. All right, so the African cannabis economy. So there's so many emerging opportunities. My main work with the Soweto Cannabis Association comes to educating people about the vast potential held within the cannabis economy. So Africa is Eden. I think we don't need to argue about that. We've got the best climate. We've got some of the best of anything and everything. So there are opportunities within medicinal cannabis production, hemp manufacturing, but of course here I'm preaching to the converted. Most of us in this room know all of this stuff, so I'm just going to skip through that. The question or key challenge: will Africa become merely a supplier of raw material, as always, or a leader in value-added production and indigenous innovation? What are we doing? Are we the guys that need aid? Or do we have something to offer to the world? Are we waiting for big pharma to come from Europe into South Africa and say, this is what we're going to do, and push the Bondo people out, push the Khoi out, push the Tswanas and all of us to the sides, and essentially monopolize this industry?
Colonize it.
They are going to, I mean, this is colonization 2.0. I was having a conversation with Pubas, and he was like, brah, I saw how this thing happened 500 years ago. The model in the last 7 years, I've been seeing it repeat itself. And that's only because we're allowing it to happen, right? If we all band together, we can stop the monopoly from happening. The power is within the people. So the problem with current frameworks, my biggest pet peeve, barriers to entry, right? Many regulatory systems, as we've heard, I think, across the past few days, in every country it seems, there are so many barriers that systematically, maybe unintentionally, include small-scale and legacy participants. We've heard from the US that they also have high licensing costs that, push out the indigenous people, complex compliance requirements, which we've heard being repeated across different contexts, corporate monopolization, my biggest fear, and my thing, lack of education and training. You know what I mean? That is the biggest thing. I always say this about the industry. We can say all we want to people about the vast potential of the cannabis industry, but if we don't teach them about cannabis and the industry and the vast potential that exists, then we're essentially talking to people that don't believe anything. They don't believe in cannabis. They've been taught that, oh, it's a drug, it's wrong, you're gonna go to prison, So they're not really thinking about, I could be a researcher within cannabis. I could study science and be a chemist. They're not teaching their children that these things exist. So my main thing is, let's educate people, especially people on the ground, especially people coming from marginalized communities. Let's go into Khayelitsha. Let's go into the Cape Flats and have mass education drives. Let education not be the barrier. It has been the barrier for so long. We heard Marlene yesterday saying the people in Bondoland, the biggest thing is that they're not educated. Yes, they don't have formal education. We don't care now about school and coming to UCT. Here I am speaking at UCT without the degree. So the main thing is, let's teach people how to build themselves up. Let's teach people what they can do with cannabis. Not only can they smoke it, because people are just like, yo, we're smoking cannabis, it's a recreational, my child's gonna get high. No. Your child can be a scientist, my nigga. Your child can be the biggest person in the world. They can travel the world speaking. Look at Wes. Wes is up to traveling the world. Guys, look. You know? So I think legalization can reproduce inequality if we are not careful, if we are not leading the conversation, if we are not leading the design of these frameworks. So let's include everyone. Okay, I'm long-winded. Let me not do that thing. So community-centered approaches have always worked when it comes to reform and redress. So what would inclusive policy look like? Micro-licensing systems for the Sleiman Zekazi who have consistently, throughout history, supplied all of us with the zol that we've been smoking. Cooperative licensing models, indigenous participation frameworks, community cultivation permits, traditional healer inclusion, which I'm seeing is being very, very prioritized lately, which is great. Reduced barriers for legacy growers, meaning less licensing, exorbitant amounts. Guys, we don't have the money. You're getting here for me already. I was like, I missed my flight. Pay more money. Guys. Local manufacturing incentives, So that's how we create a cannabis economy that is socially restorative rather than extractive. Let's move away from the 500 years of extraction into inclusion. So what we do at the Soweto Cannabis Association, we are focused on cannabis and youth development, right? So we're teaching our youth that beyond consumption, it's nice to get high. It's nice to get high and stuff, I love it. But you can be an agriculturist. You can be an entrepreneur. You can be a software developer. You can be an educator. You can be anything within this industry, So let's stop teaching our kids, let's smoke the zol, let's use the topicals, medicinal, recreational hemp. Let's actually teach them the vast potential that exists within this industry. Let's show them the pathways to freedom. Actually, I don't like to use the word economic freedom. I like to use the word economic justice, right? Let's teach people how to seek out economic justice, how to restore their dignity, how to restore the dignities of their communities. So we are linked to indigenous knowledge through myself, relate to entrepreneurship, sustainable agriculture, community upliftment, because Amanda, and skills development. So that's basically the work. We educate communities on cannabis law and policy. We advocate for equitable regulation. We support local entrepreneurs. We create dialogue around legal reform. We encourage responsible and informed participation and promote inclusion over unity. Because we've been saying, let's unite, but we don't want to have the conversations because it makes us uncomfortable. She's offending me. So our vision is a cannabis economy that includes the people most historically affected by prohibition, who also happen to carry this plant through that era. So let's not create prohibition 3.0 by excluding, because we are in 2.0 right now, right? So let's know that not bring another one. So my work as an anthropologist, cannabis is anthropological and it's also part of the ethnobotany of the world. So understanding human relationships with plants helps us understand how human societies assign meaning to plants. I'm mad at this guy. The relationship between plants and identity, the effects of colonialism on indigenous systems, and how law shapes cultural behavior. My newest thing is figuring out how we can stop this thing of customary law versus, let's bring a South African law. How do we create South African law? How do we create laws that relate and communicate to everyone so that nobody ever feels like, but this is not my law. It's a suggestion. I know how we deal with it in South Africa. They bring it out to them like, so they suggest we not smoke cannabis in public. Oh, maybe I'll follow that one. Maybe. So cannabis debates are not only legal or economic, they're also cultural, historical, and philosophical. We talk a lot about I can't be indigenous to South Africa, it's not native, but people have assigned meaning to it. So cannabis as a tool for community development. This is my biggest one. Cannabis can actually change our socio-economic reality. It can change so much. It can help us with rural revitalization, sustainable agriculture, local manufacturing, Eco-tourism. My latest thing is an eco-hemp village. I want to do that. I have so many latest things. Youth employment, women-led enterprises, and alternative economies in post-mining regions. So cannabis should contribute to local empowerment, not only international profit extraction. So, international collaboration. I love that we're all here. The international cannabis community in this room, we can learn from each other. I have been so interested in what I can learn from Sean and what I can learn from other people and how we can actually bring that home and apply it to our local context. A few weeks ago, I did a presentation, sort of the same one, for the Canadian Association of African Studies. And I know a lot of them work is like, academia, people in academia usually, drugs. And I could see it while I was doing my presentation that some of them were like, oh, she's talking about drugs. But those who can actually see will then be able to go back home into their own communities and say, well, I saw this thing, and maybe we should reach out to those people. So one thing that we all need to walk out of this room with is somebody's international's number. You must be worrying about airtime next week. How am I going to call Sean? Uses it like 5 francs per minute, yo. That's what we need to do because we have so much to learn from each other. I've learned so much over the past couple of days over what's happening in the other countries and how they're struggling and what they're winning at and how we can actually apply that. We need to unpack and see what we can do with all the things that we can learn. So, reimagining cannabis policy. This guy. Key questions for policymakers. Who benefits from legalization? Who remains excluded? What happens to traditional and legacy growers? How do we protect IKS? How do we prevent monopolization? And can regulation coexist with restorative justice? So, cannabis policy must move beyond prohibition versus commercialization and towards justice, towards inclusion and sustainability. So, I think I don't need to go through this, man. We've been talking about IKS and how we revive the IKS, right? IKS is about restoring dignity to the communities that don't have their sovereignty. The IKS could potentially lead and help us reshape our constitution, look at new ways of being and becoming. It's a holistic way of living. Africa does not fragment things. You, us, stuff like that. Our languages are inclusive. We are about community because that's how we've always thrived. So if we can bring that into the cannabis industry, if we can see ourselves as a community instead of an industry, if we can see the plant as a communal thing instead of as a commodity, we'll be able to move forward much better. And nobody's going to feel offended when I talk because we are part of the same community. We had nothing to do with colonialism. We were not there. Right? So, thank you so much, everybody, for giving me your time.
I just want to say, Tia is the future that I fucking dreamed of. This is the future. I'm so happy. I really am. Thank you very much indeed.